Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. Hopefully, the volumes are adjusted and you can hear the music alongside my words. I wanted to speak about the intelligence of a cosmic network. And I want to talk about how, right now in 2019, maybe the context, a sort of galactic or context, cosmic context, is not that fascinating to people. What I mean by that is that most people are so occupied with their just daily lives and just how their life is in some sense shaped. So many people are occupied with the programs of living that they never wonder about what is beyond the program. They never wonder about what is beyond their sight in a changing world. Now, I have recognized something. In some sense, the society has built a distaste over that which is irrational and that which is unrecognizable. We, in some sense, hate the unknown because we don't know what we're going to love about it. In some sense, what you don't know is easier to avoid. What you know is much harder. Sometimes guilt arises because you know what the right thing is and you don't do it. But if you never knew what the right thing is and you never did it, then there would be no burden in the accumulation of memory of the being. Now, I feel that currently, let's say it like this: if we were to observe any sort of civilization, or let's say we could look somehow, we had a collection of memories of different species evolving on different planets. One can playfully say that each, uh, the way life is designed is that creatures are looking through themselves first. That means before you hear another man's voice, there is a sort of intelligence of you at work. There is an objective self, there's the subjective self. The subjective self takes ownership of reality through realms of imagination, which it induces in some sense, or it is simultaneously expressing and receiving. The mind is the color of matter. All colors are, in some sense, being perceived by an intelligent awareness. This intelligent awareness is the presence of life. That means there's a way of looking at life where you're analyzing the structure, the way it is. For example, you look at an animal and you learn more about how that animal exists, whether it's cold-blooded or not. But the presence of life doesn't have to do with a sort of attribute or quality. It is the attributeless way of seeing the world that you're being. In some sense, it's like a part of your intelligence acknowledges shapes, but this part of your intelligence does not acknowledge shape. It acknowledges the shape is being watched. That means before an opinion, there's just a moment of witnessing. There's a person, his name is Aldous Huxley, and he says there's things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. I noticed a sort of hollowness. I noticed a sort of dissonance or dysfunction when I noticed that every day my mind is kind of like, imagine someone trying to push something, push this door open. Every day my mind is putting an effort to conceptualize reality, and I noticed that it's only doing it based on the past. That means sometimes there's something you don't know its value until it shows itself. Sometimes you can't judge a person based on who they were in the past. You kind of in some sense, have to allow their new self to emerge. Parents are like that, especially with children. That the parent requires to give the child an ability to see the different ways that it can be a person. It's kind of like civilization is this um, thing that's here. It's this giant statue, and everybody who looks at the statue sees a different way the statue is. Not every, mainly, mainly people are seeing differently, but eventually, as people begin to see similar views, communities develop. As communities develop, these communities are based on like one foundation. You see, I've seen so many different religious groups, scientific groups, philosophical groups of people who, in some sense, their taste for ideology has a certain ratio of the known and the unknown. A religious man, because a religious man believes in God, in some sense, God is religions. For example, that's the main difference between Hinduism and Islam. In Hinduism, everything is God. In Islam, everything belongs to God. You see, but yet that God is inconceivable. It is a sort of the whole universe being intelligent in one moment. Kind of like for fish, their God is like the ocean. It is what is holding them, what is within them, what is everywhere. For human beings, the breath is seen as a very divine phenomena. The fact that we breathe, that is in some sense the marker of life. There are days that matter speaks louder than consciousness. There are days that consciousness speaks louder than matter. When life happens to you, you feel uh, your free will feels less as an idea. When you happen to life, when you do things in life, your free will gets charged up. This is why if you want to make somebody happy, just give them work, give them something to do. When you give someone something to do, their intelligence becomes dynamic. As it becomes dynamic, the being is going into a zone of harmony. I feel success is not per se just a mindset. Success is a way of that you are in some sense moving with the world. The way you move with the world will suggest your success. Kind of like how you ride a motorcycle will decide where you end up. There is a cosmic network at work. This cosmic network, this is the last way, the last statement we can say, the last word we can use before we reach the language threshold, the realm, pretty much the edge of language. Once we move beyond the edge of language, reality functions non-conceptually, but experientially it is profound. And so what occurs is that in some sense, there's three levels to our intelligence. The ancients acknowledged this. They acknowledged this as body, mind, soul. For example, in the Buddhist text, they didn't acknowledge per se soul, but they saw that once the mind was no longer being a monkey, then in some sense there was a sort of um, uh, untouchable presence of intelligence. Trust me, human beings they have all been born. They have all wondered about the world. They have all wondered about their self based on the world they've seen, and then they've wondered what it all means. Where is it all going? Pretty much, nature is like for conscious beings, self-conscious beings. Nature is like a bus ride. It is taking us somewhere that we are not sure of, yet we live in the transition of various states. This is why you can never judge anybody. Because their eyes give them a different self, and all the other eyes of different people that see that person they simulate a self. And so in some sense we're kind of like in the same room, but internally never. You can say anything you want to, any result you want to get to in this life. There's pretty much two approaches you can have, I find. You either engineer towards it or you reverse engineer towards it. Doing nothing can be said to be a manner of reverse engineering. You see, that means if doing something is considered engineering, doing nothing is the reverse of that engineering. right? Sometimes when you do nothing, you get a dynamic snapshot of that intelligence system that you didn't have before. That means if you start living a life where you're not just obsessed with the continuity of the idea of yourself, you will begin noticing that the idea of yourself is codependent. That means you can't have a self without a world. You can't have a character without a story. You know, so pretty much we need somewhere to stand before we can speak. And so where we're standing is at first seen to be physical reality, but then physical reality seems to be standing in some sort of non-physical reality, in some sort of magnificent atmosphere of uh, comprehension and decision making. In some sense, we rebelled against nature, and that's why we became people in a world, and we're not just the world. You know, when you look at the ancient wisdom, they're telling you it's too big, so relax and just watch how the play goes on. When you look at modern technology, it wants to dismantle the problems it faces. It wants to climb over a mountain. That's our modernity. That's modern civilization. We see challenges, and we are in some sense a warrior species because animals were in some sense in violent conflict with one another. That means I believe no person can be peaceful because in their DNA there are influences that their ancestry had by war. And so their DNA is in some sense a DNA that has been exposed to war. You see, we cannot avoid it. So we are a warrior species. Think of it in a playful kind of, that what was that anime called Dragon Ball Z kind of super kind of way, where we're this warrior sort of species, but each individual has a potential to, in some sense, move beyond their limits. The ability of an evolving creature is that if its effort is endless, it will endlessly evolve. That means right now, let's say you could consider that you know nothing. Let's say that we are trying to look through the eyes of somebody who doesn't know anything, which is pretty much every child at first. They don't know anything. They become exposed to patterns of intelligence, and eventually they make conclusions. And as the external experience is exposed, the inner experience begins to take shape. The inner experience at first is replication. That means the child is everybody is a copycat when they're a young child being raised in civilization. Your mind is trying to replicate, it's trying to duplicate internally. So, eyes open, the child is born, external phenomena, changing phenomena has now been activated in consciousness because the child has entered the point of existence. So consciousness begins looking at matter in more sophisticated and complex and crystallized patterns. And this seems to be the maturity of just as we near the grave. Every step we take, in some sense, we are going to the grave. But the grave is not the grave. You see, it is death is not death. Death is only death to the idea of you. That means there's ways that your intelligence is present where it is not just dependent. It's not just depending on shared data. It's as if like the child. Think of it this way: truth is kind of like the evolution in the psychology of children on this planet. They start off with a sort of state of not being sure, and then as they process more and more of the data, they begin creating systems of certainty and clarification, because without trust you cannot live. That means any person who can trust others or doesn't have a sort of others trusting them, in some sense doesn't have a stable point of attention that can allow, like, think of it this way. um, let's say somebody has this thought of themselves that they are incapable. Let's say somebody's like, man, I'm depressed. This world is, what is this? It's a bunch of moving atoms. What's the point? I'm depressed, right? Imagine like somebody is in that mindset. Okay, now that ego has in some sense caged you in a sort of self-accepted picture in the moment. Okay, that's the issue with thinking that you're a thought. It limits you. It doesn't allow the inner world to evolve faster than the outer. In Christianity, there's a statement of wisdom that says, "To be in the world and not of it." This seems to be the words of Christ, and it's very profound because it has, in some sense, captured the evolution of the mind in the future. That means you are in something and you at first think you're of it. You think that matter is just you. But then you begin to see the you that you think you are is a universal presence of intelligence. If there is a tiny percentage, if there is a tiny if there's a tiny chance that there are unknown dimensions to our intelligence where just like a tree, you don't see how the roots are in the soil, you just know they are. Similarly, we look at our intelligence and we see its foundations are kept in deeper ways than sensory perception allows. Sensory perception is clay, ladies and gentlemen. Just like how in religious texts they say God made man from clay, then imbued the man with his breath, you know? Similarly, what are we doing with thoughts? We take language, symbolism, shapes, and as breathing creatures, these shapes move at various speeds through sequences and thus become speech, thus become the context of language, the stories of meaning. That means meaning has transformed into a story for a subjective, isolated thinker. The reason people can experience loneliness, it took us billions of years to evolve to be able to experience loneliness. There was a time that we saw ourselves indistinguishable from nature. We separated ourselves through the birth of a subjective dimension or the discovery of one of these. And then the subjective evolution began, something they don't teach, something they don't teach in school. It, you know, if my like in the future, if my kid will ask me like, what is life and death, I'll tell my child there's two times you're born and there's two times you die. That means the child is physically born, but individual consciousness is not present. And then the child becomes an identity to itself. That's the second birth. That means that's the birth of the subjective self. The objective self, it comes first. Then the subjective self develops. Psychologists say the personality of the child develops, I don't know, around the age of, 14 or 11 or something like that. Right? So that's when the child begins considering itself an actual person. And this is the issue. Shyness, nervousness, tension, fear all arise through a lack of awareness that it is the opportunity and responsibility of a lifetime to maintain the beginning and ending of your, in some sense, individualism. Right now, you're hearing me, you're an individual. This individuality, don't think it's always been there. Sometimes it's like Inception, just like the dude sitting in a cafe with that girl and is saying like, where's the good start of the beginning and the end of it? When there's a dream, when you have a dream, you don't remember the start, you don't remember the end. So this is the thing. We, as our intelligence acknowledges the start of the objective self, we know we were born, okay? But as far as the subjective self suddenly comes into place, the subjective self enters life in a dream. It's how attention steps into a pre-made pattern. This is why even if a person is pushed to the brim, their consciousness works in various personality structures. If sense of person is incapable. As the environment changes, the sense of self changes. Trust me, your subconscious mind is smarter than your conscious mind. Your subconscious mind is the ocean, the conscious mind is the iceberg in the ocean. And the unconscious is all that exists. We are not just having a relationship with existence called experience, but we are having a relationship with ourselves as existence. Do you see? We are existential creatures. We exist. We exist through a unique layout. As if there's a book I'm writing, and close to finishing it actually. It's called Godlike Spheres. And I was like, whoa, what is this? What is this? Like, if there is God, like, what is this design? The light from the sun, from that giant sphere, enters this tiny sphere, our eyeball. Like, what is this line between particles that's occurring? And so, for me, I noticed the story is changing. That's pretty much the kind of wisdom one's attained. Your wisdom is not based on how much you've heard people with long beards speak. You know, your wisdom is based on how clearly the data of the moment is being received. There's two ways that we survive. Externally, we survive through accumulation. We are hunters and gatherers, and we have to remain hunters and gatherers because our objectivity requires our own motivation. Okay, that means we haven't reached a sort of technological level where you press a button and everything you want just happens. You know, we haven't gotten there. So we have to, in some sense, go hunt for the continuity of our objective existence. You got to learn to survive. You know, which means you're gonna get a couple times paralyzed by fear. Then you begin to ride the fear. You begin. It's like this is. You can say this is the difference in true courage. Where in the like in many movie scenes, you see like. For example, in Lord of the Rings, there was a scene in the third one where they're all surrounded and something like that. And the king just takes his sword and marches towards the enemy alone. And then his army follows him, as if this king didn't have time for a speech. He just raised his sword and ran to in some sense confront the situation, right? So that's a level of courage where the mind is not intimidated by the conditions of its own conception or the way it's receiving and translating the world. It is empowered by it. You know, once you find your unconditional presence, your personality is really conditional. It's based on so many different conditions how you're a person at the moment. Or if you were to analyze your own character, you would see it has to do with various memory paths and various it's just various ways you've seen yourself. But this sort of true presence is the final acceptance. It is the view that was a response. It is the after view of a response to the inevitable finale. That means you just see the condition, and that the inner reality's condition unconditionally marches into the outer reality's conditions. Now, internally, let's say, in regards to your subjective self, you're not a hunter and gatherer. Believe it or not, you are an oscillating attention between existence and non-existence, and meaning in some sense is waving in your mind as an objective self. So as one truly begins to witness and observe, like imagine with the same dexterity, with the same fascinating alertness and attention of Isaac Newton who noticed gravity, imagine we are now looking with that same intensity at the workings of the mind. That is the next great Rubik's Cube. That is the greatest puzzle on this planet. Rather than having a neurologist come and talk about how free will is an illusion or a delusion, that is sure, of course. Go tell people they're empty. I mean that can happen. But the motivation of the species must abide by its unknown potential. That means sometimes it's so important to assume. Let me tell you this. Any being who the rights of other people and other living beings become as important as your own. Like, just like, imagine the inner freedom you seek. Imagine you notice that everybody else is seeking as well. Everybody's trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. What are we? You know? What's this happening that is happening as an idea of self with an objective body? Pretty much, Mr. Within is asking listeners to wonder about how their universe is kept in an axis of their free will. How is your will being? That's the study of attention, a sort of culture and counterculture relationship to it to evolve. That means, think of it this way. Imagine like when a young kid, when a young, uh, playful kid goes into a place where it's all only senior citizens. And the kid does something, let's say, hilarious or foolish, and then all the elders in that senior house or wherever, like, you know, retirement home or something, they all begin laughing. They all begin feel alive because their mind is perceiving a potential of life that existed in them at some point in their memory. So, intelligence from an individual personality that has attributes will kind of move towards an attributeless collective presence. Pretty much what you knew before becomes unknown. That's called change. And as that occurs, as the unknown becomes your teacher, then your inner reality is choosing to be more of a decision maker. Your subjective self is being given more freedom than your objective self. When your subjective self is given more freedom than your objective self, what that means is suddenly you begin paying attention to how you're being. As you pay attention to how you're being, you see it is by the nature. If you were completely still and silent, and in some sense, if you had never moved and if you have never said anything, you would be never anybody. You see, the sense of a doership relies on the dynamism of a sort of movement and noise. And by noise, I mean speech and language itself. Because on some level, I mean, like, of course, I'm sitting here and I'm talking about, like, the intelligence of a sort of cosmic network, but at the same time, we're sophisticated. You can say we're advanced apes making sophisticated mouth noises. We are creatures that are simply being complex. And so all of life has to do with it. It has to do with how far your experiences have intensified and brought forth complexity. For me, depression in a person is the sign of two things. It is a sign of, let's say, an ailment. At the same time, it is the sign of a complexity. That means the depressed person is having actually a sort of deep look at things. That sometimes it's a long-term inevitable kind of chaos that makes you not care for the short-term order of things. If you think this universe, everything's gonna, there's no point to anything, then you will never be pointed anywhere in life because there's no care, there's no container for acceptance of the value that the experience can bring it one thing early on, and I'm going to say to you very playfully, what the logos. The logos is an ancient Greek word, and for example, anything that has the words like logi at the end of it, it's suggesting the logos was an inner guiding voice. It was the soul of uh, the moment of existence, kind of moving the experience through certain sequences of abstract data or abstract reality. Because, believe it or not, our minds are being virtual reality. Like right now, I'm sitting here, and let's say I think of a thought of, let me see what I like. What can come to me. Let's say I imagine right now, I'm climbing the tree, and when I get to the top of the tree, I see that the tree, in some sense, is there's a bird's nest there. So right now, imagine you climb a tree and you see a bird's nest right there. Okay, so what that is in some sense, my words are simulating image. Language leads to image. Okay, and that image right now, me just even right now in this current moment, I'm imagining like me set on the tree beside, like, let's say there's let's be playful. Let's say there's an eagle's nest. I'm sitting on a tree branch where there's like three giant eagles there. So now that thought is a sort of virtual realism to my intelligence. It's virtually real in some way, but not in a sensory way. So it's an inner virtual reality. You see, so our personalities, our stories, our meaning of life, that whole thing, that the whole atmosphere is of an inner invisible value. This is why faith. You need to have faith in like that the like in gravity to be able to eat with a spoon and not have it just suddenly be if you throw it endlessly moving in space. So what I mean by that is that there's a sort of simulation going on behind our eyes that seems to be multidimensional, and it seems to be what is giving the multiple dimensions to objective matter. That means I see, for example, in front of me, I'm seeing like this computer right now. Okay, this computer is just an object, and then when I think about it, and I begin entertaining the various scientific contexts of its design, then layers of ideology are being added on it. So pretty much our attention is an empty piece of paper, and anything that occurs in that experience is us drawing lines on this. This is why I kind of caught on to this, that there's a sort of geometrical way that we can, like if we were to see all the different ideas of self that we have throughout the day, it would have a geometrical pattern. It can be given a geometrical pattern. And that geometrical pattern will show you how your free will is cycling in this existence. Your free will is in a cycle. It happens in cycles. Intelligence, life and death, it's all cyclical. When it's cyclical, that means death and life are like these two separate dimensions, and you're kind of swimming in between both of them. You're going from one to the other, above water, below water, above water, below water. In manifest individual animated life into non-manifest, kind of present, the potential realm. That means like you can think of like if there were certain shamans and Amazonian tribes that in some sense they acknowledged an actual world and they acknowledged a spirit world. Okay? And I find it's the same. This spirit world and actual world, it's pretty much a scientist could look at that same idea as a realm where energy is just purely potential. That's kind of heaven. In heaven, let's say you can get anything you want. That means pure potential. You know. But so what that means is it's potential energy. That's the spirit world, and the physical world is kinetic energy. Okay, it's this potential force kind of changing into a sort of activity. So I believe it's not that the universe began from nothing, is that nothing was the empty page laid upon, the existence by an unknown. It's too far. We can't see. We can't see beyond language. That's the thing. You're not just limited to your sensory perception. You're also limited to the ability of your mind to see how language is being warped. Sometimes uh, creativity can be so powerful that it redesigns or the way my memories existed to me changed. I can give you a good example of this. Actually, a kind of funny example of this. Yeah. It's real, like what I'm telling you. It's something that happened to me when I was young. It's pretty much at the age of 7 from Iran. My family moved to Vancouver, and I remember attending grade one only knowing two words. And so what happened was, look at how interesting and fascinating our minds are. I remember I just knew only two words of my name. Okay, it was like the first day of, I was, anyways. So as I'm there, I I find myself in a moment where the teacher is shouting at me, as if the teacher is going one by one to the students, and now the teacher has come to me and is shouting something at me, and I couldn't understand then what she was saying. Okay, so my mind recorded her voice, recorded the sounds she generated in her speech, but could not consciously comprehend it. That means my personality was not established enough to recognize what she was saying. Okay, so I remember she said something. She shouts. I just see an angry person, kind of shouting, and I remember I just knew yes and no, so I said yes. Like she asked me a question, I said yes. Then she suddenly snapped out of the anger. She laughed, and then she repeated the same question, and I said no. And then she said something else, and I was just saying yes, no, yes, no. That was kind of my solution, like with the limited kind of awareness of the English language. Okay, so now here's the fascinating thing. Years later, suddenly that memory came to me. I visited that memory again, and the words were there. I could, because now it was like when I learned the English language, all the memories where my voice, my ears had recorded English speech, but I had not understood it. It suddenly understood it. So that's the fascinating thing. That as your knowledge in the present moment evolves, it also gives depth to your previous memories. So your past and childhood is never the same childhood you experience. Your memories are never the same memories. They can't be. Because as you change, you attain a dimensional depth. This dimensional depth extends the previous past. It's as if your future rebuilds a part of the past. It's something like that, but it's all subconscious. These are our playful interpretations of the workings of the unknown mind. You know, that means either we look at our intelligence in this moment and say, either it's the cause, either what we're seeing is being our cause, or we are being an effect of this. Okay? So either physical reality is an effect of your intelligence, or physical reality is the cause of your existence. And this is the main division between all the people in this world in regards to theists and atheists, especially. That one of them is acknowledging that matter, physical reality, is the effect of some truth, and
The other angle is saying no, physical reality is the cause because of your whole identity and formation of yourself exists from the brain, which seems to be a materialistic phenomenon. But when I was told that the atom is 99.9% empty, you know, when I was told in some sense that energy is being a shape, pure honesty is just silent witnessing without resistance. When you resist something, you're caught in the past, and mainly because it's a subtler form of anger. Intolerance is it's like the plague. Back in the day, like, let me see, let me give you the correct date actually. In From 1629 to 1631, there was an Italian plague. Okay, and they call it outbreaks of bubonic plague, which ravaged northern and central Italy. This epidemic, often referred to as the Great Plague of Milan, claimed possibly 1 million lives, or about 25% of the population. Okay, this episode is considered one of the later outbreaks of the centuries-long pandemic of bubonic plague, which began with the Black Death. So similarly, just like how there was a plague, a sort of inefficiency being passed around, similarly, that's the issue of current society. That it's no longer diseases that are occurring like the plague. Our medical sciences protected us from unnecessary deaths. You know. However, the plague is in the wrong ideology moving in the minds of men, in the minds of our species. Okay, we're 8 billion people. If I ask you right now, how does war begin, or where does war begin first? What would you say? You would say it begins when the person attacks, right? I would say no. War begins in the minds of men. It begins in your. It starts from the inner realities of two beings being in such disharmony that they have to eradicate the other, or they will feel they are going to be eradicated. That's war. War is when one intelligence has chosen to conquer another intelligence. Okay. However, their intelligence justifies it based on language. That means war begins because there's communication is inefficient. And once the communication is inefficient, that means the universe and all the decisions being made in that war will suffer inefficiency. So we have to stop unnecessary ideology that brings inefficient um, activity for our species. How do we do this on a mass scale? 8 billion people. When I was thinking about it, I just thought that there's only one way. You know, you can't just create an ideology and suddenly the whole world has to become that ideology. That's in the inner, that's the plague, you know, the ideological plague. You know, all these people fighting over belief systems, raging over belief systems. Trust me, that's the plague of one idea trying to outlive all other ideology, to be the one ruler of them all. You know? There is a sort of belief prior to experience, and then there's a belief after experience. The belief after experience is healthy, the belief before experience is unhealthy because it can oftentimes limit you from having the actual experience. That means if you feel a certain person is a bad person, you will never wonder who else they are. You see? In our own inner universe, our intolerance makes us an executioner of people, of the impressions that people give us. I have experienced this in many moments. I've experienced moments where I was in complete harmony in a sort of social setting. It was an incredible day, you know. And then there's been moments where I have, in some sense, fallen into the shadow of the shadow. I walked more in the shadow of the day than in brighter parts. And what that means is that I notice social inefficiency, and I recognize that when every man thinks that it's kind of doesn't make sense, kind of to just live for yourself. Objectively, it does. Subjectively, it doesn't. That means it's like there are many barriers to every person's life. Let's say throughout the day. You see, it's not. I was sitting on the subway and I just saw for a second that wow, what's going on? And I'm like, wow, it's like an animal evolved to a point where it stood on its 2 feet, it could use its hands, wore clothing, and built a train. Okay, those are the success of our species. Our species has had unique. Uh, our species has done things that animals, in some senses, are inconceivable. When we look at them and wonder if they ever get there. I mean, honestly, what can I say when we get to ideas that are no longer dualistic? I can only speak about the dual. The non-dual will be left to poetry. So, 8 billion beings on this planet. Let's just playfully think: what's the best thing 8 billion beings could do on a rock in the middle of nowhere? Well, the first thing is that if 8 billion people value long-term success, they will be able to easily change the short term. Okay? But people usually want short-term success because it's a competitive, jungle out there. It's kind of like man asked God why he was created and why he was even the mistake was allowed to be made by the creator. And the creator looked at man and said, "Don't ask too many questions." The evolution of thought does not have to do only with the evolution of biology. It has to do with the sort of uh, sort of alignment and rhythm, as if cosmic intelligence, the unknown, it's like the way your knowledge moves. Once you trust the unknown and you become fearless instantly, you in some sense realize, okay, let me see how the world moves and then let my movement move. So you allow the data to be processed and then you decide. The issue with emotions is that they make you ignore other streams of data. They limit your channel of data processing. To be playfully technical about this metaphysical notion. It's like whether you look at an atom and you either see through the lens of there being, for example, the neutron, proton, electron kind of dynamic, and then you dive more deeper into that and you find quarks, and the smallest particles in matter, you begin to come to a point that each diagram of the level of exploration is all being the same substance. So all the dimensions within us are being one moment. Your intelligence is being one moment. And it's just being the moment. Even the numerical analysis and containment of it doesn't need to be there. As we stop these unnecessary ideological plagues, and an ideological plague is in some sense ideal worship. People are freaking out because of like having no idea why we're here. I feel like existentially. So in some sense, they're trying to find a sort of shelter, a sort of bunker, a sort of truth of another person to justify how they are being true. You only need salvation if you feel you're not there yet. What that means is, right now, imagine like from a religious perspective, okay? You say somebody makes a decision and they go to heaven or hell, right? Now let's say somebody back in the day, your ancestry or something, they made a decision and they went to heaven. They're in heaven right now. Now from heaven, imagine they're watching you on earth, okay? And what I mean by that is that you're kind of like in this state where just evolve beyond how you contain yourself. You will automatically attain the ultimate enlightenment, the ultimate recognition of how intelligence is being. The stories of life are divided pretty much into a character, into a setting, and in some sense, the relationship of this character with the setting, and eventually the relationship of the character with how it is a part of the setting, and then eventually the relationship of how the character and the setting are all both, not the character. That means once you discover the cosmic network that moves beyond the veil of thoughts, transcends the language threshold, truth is as true as you are. 8 billion beings must find that after we get bored of just creating our senses of self, your intelligence wants to create worlds. When it wants to create worlds, it pays attention to the world. When it pays attention to the world, its nature automatically justifies. That means fundamentally, regardless of how evil or good of a person you are, nature is moving you. Like, it's like regard that, well, what the evil person and the good person have in common, they both have a heart that's beating in their chest. You know. And that heart is neither good or evil. It is just nature's movement. So fundamentally, when you discover that a vast percentage of your intelligence is how the world is naturally being here, and your mind at least considers itself a sort of nothing and everything at the same time. That's why it has the effort to conceive those ideas. As Maulana Rumi tells us, the Sufi mystic, ancient Persian kind of poet, he says, "Let the waters settle, and you shall see the moon and the stars mirrored in your being." That means let life just be itself so you get a sense of who you are before anybody tells you anything. Once you have established a sort of independence, individual point of being, now it becomes much easier to communicate, and in some sense, your mind has a healthier way of moving through not just physical elements, but non-physical elements of reality. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys. Uh, I'm probably going to start writing it in the title, but I can open this up to questions or Q&A or So anybody who's listening, if you're like, what do you guys think? Here, we'll put a question of the day. Okay, the quote is like, um, a ship. I think it's a. I don't know who it's ascribed to, but I think it's William Shedd. Anyways, the quote says a ship is okay. I was under the impression it was from Shakespeare, but I don't know. The quote says a ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for, are built for. Your sense of self is in its comfort zone, in its safe kind of space. But that's not why the idea of you exists, to just be safe and comfortable. It's here to see the world, to experience the dimensions of the world fully in order to comprehend the fulfilled life. Rabindranath Tagore tells us you can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. Rabindranath Tagore also says it is very simple to be happy, but it is very difficult to be simple. Sometimes in simplicity, sometimes through simplicity, we can handle complexity best. Open your eyes to a world that never needs to fail. It's just, its success takes longer or has delays. That's how we should think. We should think that rather than we're trying to find heaven or per se even build heaven on earth, we recognize earth is in heaven. It is the heavens that keep the earth. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Much blessings.